Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little darker, a story about the quiet indignities of war that no training manual ever mentioned. We're diving into the daily life inside a Sherman tank, where bravery smelled faintly of gasoline, sweat, and desperation. Forget the glory shots of armored columns rolling triumphantly through France. The truth, most of the time it was 5 men trapped in a steel box trying not to breathe too deeply. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these calm, deep dives into history's unglamorous corners. Drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and whether you're listening to fall asleep or just can't stop learning. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in Normandy, July 1944. The good news, you're alive, which already puts you ahead of the statistics. The bad news, you're about to spend the next 12 hours sealed inside a 30-ton M4 Sherman tank, and nature still calls in a war zone. Inside, the air is already heavy. The Ford GAA V8 engine, idling behind a thin steel partition, hums at about 2,600 revolutions per minute, radiating heat that pushes the temperature past 95 degrees Fahrenheit before the sun even clears the hedgerow. The crew compartment is barely 8 feet long, 6 feet wide, and 5 feet high, about the interior space of a compact van. Minus the windows and plus a cannon, you share that space with 4 other men: the driver, bow gunner, loader gunner, and you, the commander. It's tight enough that when one man scratches his nose, 3 others have to shift. The smell is layered: oil, gun grease, canvas, sweat, the faint ammonia sting of urine bottles that no one wants to talk about. Imagine sharing your car with 4 roommates for a week. You can't open the doors, the engine never turns off, and all of you are. That's tank life. Breakfast came hours ago. Sea rations eaten out of dented tins beside the tank before dawn. Powdered eggs, cold coffee, maybe some ham, and lima beans if you were unlucky. You ate more than you needed because no one knew when the next break would come. Tankers joked that breakfast was the last hot meal until Berlin. The US 3rd Armored Division, nicknamed Spearhead, was advancing south of St. Lo that week, grinding forward through the bocage country, dense hedgerows, narrow lanes, the constant threat of German Panzerfausts behind every bush. The Sherman's armor was only about 2 inches thick on the sides. The German Tiger, I could punch through that from nearly a mile away. So you stayed buttoned up, meaning every hatch closed, every bit of ventilation sealed. That's where the bathroom situation gets interesting. No one built the Sherman with comfort in mind. The technical manual TM9 731A described the interior as ergonomically sufficient for extended operation, which is army speak for "you'll fit." Technically, there was no toilet, of course, no privacy. Just 5 men in proximity that modern HR departments would classify as a violation. Veteran tanker Robert Hale of the 3rd Armored's 36th Tank Battalion once wrote in a letter home, "They gave us plenty of shells, but not a single instruction on what to do when we had to go. After a few days, we figured it out. Coffee cans and shame." That phrase stuck. Coffee cans and shame. It became unofficial doctrine. The standard issue 1-pint coffee can from the same supply as the Army's field kitchens doubled as emergency relief equipment. The technique was simple, though execution required precision and balance, especially when the tank was moving. Usually the driver or bow gunner took first turn because their seats were closest to the floor and least visible. You waited for a lull in movement, unscrewed the canteen cap, and prayed for good aim. Sometimes, during long road marches, the can was passed around like contraband. Full cans were sealed with tape and labeled "Do Not Open." When opportunity allowed, they were discreetly dumped outside the tank, though in combat. That opportunity might not come for hours. Modern comparison, think of a long-haul road trip. No rest stops, no windows, and every jolt threatens disaster. That's the Sherman experience. By mid-morning, condensation starts forming on the inside walls, streaking down like sweat. The engine's heat mixes with human breath and gunpowder residue, turning the compartment into a metallic sauna. One report measured carbon monoxide levels inside running tanks at nearly 400 parts per million, enough to make men dizzy. So crews cracked periscopes slightly for airflow, which also invited the smell of cordite and exhaust. The floor vibrates continuously. Every turn of the tracks clatters against the suspension, the VVSS system, vertical volutes, springs that offer just enough cushion to keep your teeth but not your sanity. The noise is so constant that silence feels unnatural when you finally climb out. To talk, you use the intercom, a network of rubber throat mics wired through the hull. Voices sound tinny and hollow, like ghosts trapped in the metal. When someone sneezes, it echoes. When someone burps, everyone knows what they had for breakfast. There's an odd intimacy to this kind of confinement. You learn each man's breathing rhythm, the way the loader mutters numbers while stacking 75mm shells, the soft hum of the gunner checking elevation gears. You stop noticing the smell until fresh air rushes in, and then you remember what you've been marinating in. Some crews tried creative solutions, small funnels attached to hoses leading through floor drains, but those drains were designed for spent shell casings, not plumbing. More than one tank reportedly left a yellow trail in its wake. The official records don't confirm that, but the veterans' jokes do. They said the Sherman was roomy. They didn't mention the facilities. By late morning, the tank halts. The engine coughs to silence. For the first time in hours, it's quiet enough to hear birds outside. Someone opens a hatch just wide enough to pass up an empty can. The air that rushes in smells of damp earth and diesel heaven compared to what's inside. The commander checks his wristwatch. 10:42 a.m. They've been sealed in for nearly 4 hours. The crew stretches what little they can, rolling shoulders, flexing knees, shaking out cramps. The radio crackles with orders: advance another half-mile and hold position near a hedgerow.
Lunch will have to wait. You think about home, about real bathrooms,
about cool tile floors and porcelain bowls and privacy. Then you remember, back home, people are worrying about ration stamps and newspaper headlines. Out here, you worry about whether the next shell will punch through 2 inches of steel. The tank lurches forward again. Dust seeps in through microscopic gaps. Sweat stings your eyes. Somewhere behind you, the engine coughs, belches black smoke, then settles back into its rhythmic drone. You glance at the relief tucked beside the driver's seat and wonder how full it is. One tanker later joked that a full Sherman could be identified by smell before sight. He wasn't wrong. Between gasoline fumes, body odor, and improvised waste containers, the new tank smell didn't last long, according to after-action reports. Some crews used chlorine tablets meant for water purification to neutralize odors. It didn't help much, just made everything smell like a swimming pool of misery, one veteran said, and yet, somehow, they adapted. Human beings are remarkably good at normalizing discomfort when there's no alternative. The war wasn't fought by heroes in shining armor. It was fought by tired, unshaven men in greasy coveralls who found dignity in small victories, like finding an empty can when you really needed one. Imagine your office's worst day: no air conditioning, coffee machine broken, 5 co-workers crammed into a cubicle. Now add ammunition racks, 90 gallons of high-octane fuel, and the occasional explosion outside. You're close. The Sherman crews endured because they had to. They joked because humor was oxygen. And they drank coffee, gallons of it, even though they knew it was a terrible idea. Afternoon heat builds. The tank becomes an oven, every surface too hot to touch. Sweat runs down your back, pooling in your boots. The loader curses softly as he bumps his head on the gun breech again. The commander peeks through the periscope, spotting movement in a distant tree line.
Orders crackle over the radio. Prepare for contact. Everyone tenses.
Someone shifts their foot and accidentally kicks the coffee can.
Rattles across the floor.
Nobody laughs this time. The world outside is noise artillery, thuds, engines growling, the hiss of burning fuel.
Inside, it's the slow rhythm of breathing and the sharp, metallic click of safety catches.
Every man is alone in his thoughts, pretending he doesn't need to go, pretending the smell doesn't bother him, pretending this is normal. When the shells start landing, the question isn't if you'll have to go, it's where you'll aim the coffee can when the tank hits a bump. You know that feeling when you're stuck in traffic on a scorching day. Windows rolled up and every breath tastes like hot metal. Now imagine the windows are welded shut, the seat vibrates with the rumble of an engine the size of a small cottage, and the air smells of fuel, sweat, and gunpowder. Welcome to a Sherman tank at noon during Operation Cobra, July 1944, outside Saint-Lô, France. By this point in the Normandy campaign, the US 3rd Armored Division had been pushing through the bocage for weeks, hedgerows so thick that each field felt like its own fortress. Every advance was measured in yards, every halt accompanied by the smell of something burning diesel, cordite, or nerves. Inside the M4A3 Sherman, the Ford GAA V8 engine throbbed constantly at 2,600 RPM, producing a deafening metallic heartbeat. The heat poured forward into the fighting compartment, raising the temperature to well over 110 degrees. Crews joked that you didn't need a stove. You could fry spam on the gearbox. The crew was sealed in tight. Opening the hatch even an inch risked a sniper's bullet or a shell fragment. Airflow came from two small fans mounted near the radio, each roughly the size of a cereal bowl. They were supposed to pull air through filters packed with oil and felt. In reality, the filters clogged with dust and burned powder within hours, so the fans just moved the same stale air in circles. It wasn't just heat, it was the smell. Gunpowder residue, engine exhaust, oil vapor, and the musky scent of 5 men who hadn't bathed in days blended into something that could peel paint. Veterans later said it smelled like the inside of a rifle barrel that had been left out in the sun. The odor settled into uniforms, into hair, into memory. Each time the 75mm M3 cannon fired, the whole tank lurched. The casing slammed out of the breech and rolled across the steel floor, hissing like a kettle. The loader would snatch it up using asbestos-lined gloves and drop it into the spent shell bin, which radiated heat like a small furnace. After a few minutes, the compartment filled with cordite smoke, fine enough to sting the eyes but thick enough to taste. The manual said crews should ventilate after every few rounds. The manual, of course, wasn't written for people being shot at, so they carried on coughing and blinking, pretending it wasn't that bad. One veteran, Sergeant George Horton of the 33rd Armored Regiment, later wrote, "The air got so foul that our throats burned. We figured if the Germans didn't kill us, the fumes might." Sometimes the gunner tied a rag around his mouth like an improvised gas mask. It didn't help much, but it made him feel like he was doing something. By midday, the battle was in full swing. Tanks advanced in short bursts, 20 yards forward, halt, fire, reverse. The motion churned up dust and diesel smoke that slipped in through every seam. Outside, the sound of American M7 Priest howitzers echoed like distant thunder. Inside, the clang of the breech, the whine of gears, and the constant vibration blurred together into one endless mechanical hum. Imagine sitting inside a running clothes dryer filled with hot sand and the smell of fireworks. That was the comfort level, and then came the biological reality. Hours of combat meant hours without opening a hatch. Relief cans from the morning were now full sealed with tape and shoved into corners. But battle didn't pause for plumbing. When necessity returned, the crew followed an unspoken routine that was equal parts engineering and humiliation. Step 1. The smallest man, often the bow gunner, took the coffee can. Step 2. He tried to steady himself between gear shifts while the driver cursed the bumps. Step 3. Everyone else politely looked the other way, though away didn't exist in a space 8 feet long. If the tank jolted at the wrong moment, well, let's just say cleanup was another day's problem. The British Sherman Firefly crews reported the same misery. Their tanks mounted the longer 17-pounder gun, which filled the fighting compartment with even more fumes. One British officer described it as sitting in a kettle of cordite soup. German Tiger, the Fizz crews, didn't have it much better. Though their tanks were larger and better armoured, the Maybach HL 230 engine generated suffocating heat. German veterans recalled scraping condensation from the inside walls and drinking it when water ran low. So across all armies, the experience converged. The smell of oil, metal, sweat, and fear. The colour of the air was grey. The sound never stopped. After a few hours, senses began to dull. The constant noise became background music. The odor, a kind of invisible blanket. The loader's ears rang from the repeated shockwave of the gun. The driver's shoulders ached from wrestling the steering levers. Someone always had a headache. Sometimes, in the worst heat, men hallucinated faint breezes that weren't there. Psychologically, tankers coped the same way soldiers always have with humor. Someone would mutter, "The Sherman's got everything but a toilet," and another would answer, "Yeah," and sometimes even that's debatable. They joked about writing the Army Ordnance Department to request ventilation holes shaped like hearts. It was gallows humor, but it worked. Laughter, even muffled behind intercom static, kept fear at bay. From time to time, the commander cracked his periscope open a fraction, hoping for fresh air. The gust that came in smelled of burnt wheat and cordite, better than the tank's interior, but still acrid. Outside, artillery from both sides turned the French countryside into rolling clouds of dust. The tank advanced another hedgerow, turret swinging left. Through the periscope, the commander caught sight of a knocked-out German Panzer IV, its crew lying motionless beside it. For a brief moment, the heat, the smell, the discomfort, all of it felt trivial compared to that view. Then the tank jolted forward again, back to routine. Even hydration was a delicate balance. Each man carried 2 canteens of lukewarm water. Drink too much and you'd need the cans sooner. Drink too little and heat exhaustion would set in. Veterans said they tried to sweat strategically, pacing their movements to conserve moisture. By late afternoon, everything inside the tank was coated in a fine film of dust and sweat. The floor was slick with oil and condensation. The ammunition smelled faintly of brass polish and human grime. Every breath tasted recycled. Outside, Operation Cobra was succeeding the German lines cracking under continuous bombardment, but inside, the crew's small world was collapsing into its own ecosystem of heat and odor. To keep focus, men invented distractions. The gunner silently recited baseball stats. The loader planned his next letter home, though he'd never mentioned the part about coffee cans. The driver daydreamed about ice water, real toilets, and clean sheets. Humans have an infinite capacity to pretend things are normal when there's no other choice. One officer later said, "You didn't think about comfort. You thought about the next shell, the next gear shift, the next field. The smell was just part of the war." Imagine your office printer running non-stop in a closet-sized room while someone sprays diesel in the air. That's how concentration worked here. Mechanical, detached, survival-focused. By evening, the light outside turns amber through the periscope glass. The engine's growl softens as the column halts near a hedgerow. The radio crackles with partial words. Hold position, refuel, stand by. The commander exhales, realizing he's been holding his breath for minutes at a time. The loader slumps against the turret wall, slick with sweat. The gunner wipes grime from his face using the same rag that cleaned shell casings. No one speaks. There's nothing left to say. The air inside feels alive, dense, humid, almost sentient. A mixture of burned powder, hot oil, and human waste curls in the corners. You could scrape it with a knife. The men know they'll have to open the hatch soon, but the field's still hot with sniper fire, so they wait. Minutes stretch into an hour. The tank hums quietly, metal ticking as it cools. Somewhere outside, a distant explosion rolls across the fields. The crew barely reacts. They've grown used to it, the way you stop noticing the hum of a refrigerator after a while. By the time darkness starts to fall, the battle has moved east. The hedgerows are quiet. The crew's bodies ache, their uniforms stiff with sweat and dust. The relief cans are full. The air feels like a physical weight pressing down, and still, the hatches remain sealed. By evening, the stench inside the tank had become its own battlefield, and the crew still hadn't opened the hatch. You know that feeling when you finally get home from a long road trip. Open the car door and that wave of stale air hits you, the smell of fast food wrappers, sweat and exhaustion. Now imagine that smell multiplied by engine fumes, gunpowder, and 5 grown men who haven't showered in days. That was the Sherman's version of arrival. You could air out a car. Tanks didn't get that luxury. By the time the 3rd Armored Division's tanks rolled back from St. Lo, On July 27, 1944, the sun was sinking low and the hedgerows glowed orange in the fading light. The battle noise had drifted eastward, replaced by the slow mechanical clicking of cooling engines. For tank crews, the end of a mission wasn't a triumphant moment, it was a checklist. Engines off, turrets secured, guns cleared. Relief cans, if any, carefully discarded. That last step was unofficial but universally understood. Someone, usually the youngest crewman, was assigned to sanitation detail, meaning he'd climb out, dig a small hole behind the tank, and dispose of the evidence. No one spoke of it.
No one needed to. War had its own etiquette. When the hatches finally cracked open, the first lungful of fresh air was almost dizzying.
Crews described it like stepping from a furnace into a breeze. They'd squint into the sunset, gulping air that smelled of mud, diesel, and grass, anything but the interior stench they'd been stewing in all day. One tanker wrote later, "You never forget that first breath after 12 hours sealed inside. You could taste freedom in the dust." The ritual after each mission was always the same. The crew climbed out stiff-legged like old men. They stretched, coughed, and blinked against the sudden quiet. Someone usually laughed, not because anything was funny, but because laughter helped shake off the weight of the day.
Maintenance came next.
The Sherman might have survived the battle, but it demanded attention like a spoiled child. Tracks needed tensioning.
Engine oil had to be topped off, filters clean.
The floor inside was coated with dust, spilled grease, and shell residue. Every surface seemed to radiate grime. Crews scrubbed the interior with rags soaked in gasoline, even though they knew it made the smell worse before it got better. The fumes lingered in their clothes for days, but it was part of the rhythm work. Sweat, clean, repeat. Sometimes they found traces of the day's chaos shrapnel dents, burned insulation, bits of earth blown through seams. One driver recalled finding a bullet lodged in the periscope mount. So close I could have kissed it. Then there was personal cleanup, though cleanup might be generous. Water was rationed, so washing meant wiping your face with a damp rag or using a bit of shaving cream as makeshift soap. Most men carried an extra pair of socks, a razor, and a towel. Everything else depended on luck. German tank crews faced the same problem. Their Tiger I and Panther tanks were larger, but space didn't equal comfort. The Maybach engines baked the interiors, and when missions ended, the crews stripped down and washed in cold water from their radiators, sometimes still steaming. Soviet and British crews did the same with melted snow or rain barrels. One German veteran from the Panzerlehr division recalled, "We smelled like metal and sweat." But so did everyone else. After a while, it was the smell of survival. Among the Americans, humor filled the gaps that soap couldn't. The 3rd Armored. Crews had running jokes about awarding medals for most creative use of a coffee can. Another unofficial title went to whoever could still eat sea rations in that heat without complaining. It was dark humor, deadpan and simple, but it bonded them. Psychologists later called it gallows adjustment, the mind's way of staying sane by normalizing discomfort. To the men, it was just daily life. You didn't dwell on the absurdity because doing so might break you. They developed unspoken rules: never mention the smell, never comment when someone needed the can,
never look directly at whoever was handling it.
Pretend dignity existed even when it didn't. For every tank that returned, another didn't. The US Army's 3rd Armored Division suffered some of the highest losses of the European campaign, over 6 and 48. Tanks destroyed and nearly 2,500 crewmen killed or wounded by the war's end. The average Sherman crew lasted under 6 weeks in sustained combat before replacement. That brutal turnover made camaraderie fragile but intense. You might share a tank with the same men for only a month, but in that time, you shared more than space. You shared silence, smells, and fears that outsiders couldn't imagine. In post-war interviews, veterans often spoke less about gunfights and more about the routines, the heat, the noise, the exhaustion, and the endless cleaning afterward. The human details lingered longer than the tactical ones. Once maintenance was finished, the tanks were lined up in makeshift bivouacs, rows of metal shapes outlined against the evening haze. Engines clicked softly as they cooled. Inside, the smell of oil and sweat was finally replaced by the faint sweetness of wet grass and campfire smoke. dinner, if it came, was sea rations warmed on engine manifolds, pork and beans,
Hash, or sometimes nothing but biscuits.
coffee brewed thick and bitter in dented tins. It was ironic, one tanker noted, that coffee had started and ended their day, one way or another. They sat on the turrets, feet dangling, watching the dusk settle. Conversation was sparse. The war didn't end when the engine stopped. It just got quieter. There were always moments of quiet humanity tucked between the machinery. Someone would produce a deck of cards, though hands trembled too much to shuffle properly. Another might write a letter home by flashlight, careful not to describe anything too vivid. The army encouraged optimism in correspondence, not the smell of cordite and urine. The bodies adapted faster than minds did. Muscles recovered overnight, but the nerves took longer. Even when resting, men said they felt the phantom vibration of the engine beneath them, like the heartbeat of a machine that refused to die. Some couldn't sleep unless something nearby was humming. Mechanized war demanded more from the body than it was built for. Tanks could drive for 12 hours straight, but the humans inside couldn't. Air filters choked, engines overheated, and men suffered the same way overworked systems doing their best under impossible conditions. WLC proved what designers hadn't yet solved. Machines could endure longer than their operators, yet, strangely, that endurance rubbed off. Crews learned to pace themselves like engines, slow movements, minimal torque, steady rhythm. It was survival by imitation. Modern tankers still describe their vehicles as alive. The WP crews started that tradition. When your life depends on something every day, you start treating it like a partner. You cleaned it, cursed it, even talked to it. But at day's end, both man and machine were equally exhausted. Sometimes the smell never really left. Veterans joked that they could tell an old tanker by the way he wrinkled his nose at diesel fumes. Decades later, reunions would spark laughter about the coffee can days. The embarrassment faded. The camaraderie didn't. There's something strangely human about how quickly people normalize discomfort when everyone's suffering equally. Privacy vanished. But dignity found new definitions, like helping a buddy clean his filter while pretending not to see his stained gloves. War made men equal in ways peace never could. Night deepened over Normandy. The fields buzzed with insects, and somewhere distant, artillery flashed like silent lightning. Crews lay on tarps beside their tanks, heads resting on helmets, the air finally cool enough to breathe deeply. They stared up at the stars, trying not to think about how many more missions waited at dawn. In the silence, someone muttered, "We smell like hell." Another replied, "Better than the alternative." Quiet laughter rippled through the dark. For a moment, everything felt almost normal. The tanks loomed nearby, hulking silhouettes against the night sky, still warm, still ticking, still ready. Inside them lingered the day's ghosts, the smell, the noise, the confinement. Tomorrow would bring the same, but for now, there was still air to breathe and ground to lie on. History remembers the tanks that broke through the hedgerows, not the men who spent hours inside, waiting for the chance to breathe fresh air again. You know that feeling when you try to use a public restroom on a moving train, and just as you're about to sit down, the carriage lurches? Now stretch that moment over an entire ocean.
Add freezing salt spray, the stench of diesel,
And the occasional artillery blast, and you'll have a fair idea of what it was like to answer nature's call aboard a World War II destroyer in the North Atlantic. The year is 1942, and you're aboard the USS O'Brien, DD-415, a Sims-class destroyer escorting convoy HX-186 from Halifax to Liverpool. The job sounds noble on paper, protect merchant ships from German U-boats, but in reality it's a week of cold, damp misery, punctuated by moments of raw panic. The ship pitches, rolls and groans through grey water that seems determined to throw you back to shore. The O'Brien measures just 348 feet long and 36 feet wide, slender enough that each swell grabs hold of her hull and tosses her like driftwood.
Every 20 seconds the deck drops out from under you.
Then rises again, sending coffee, tools, and stomachs in all directions. Below deck, tucked amid the steel ribs of the ship, are the heads. That's naval slang for bathrooms, a term dating back to wooden sailing ships, when the toilet was literally a hole cut in the bow or head of the vessel.
Modern destroyers were more advanced.
But only slightly. Each head consisted of a row of stainless steel toilets mounted shoulder to shoulder along one bulkhead. No partitions, no privacy, just a thin railing to keep sailors from sliding off mid-flush. The flushing system used seawater pumped through narrow pipes, then drained directly overboard. During calm seas it worked fine. In a North Atlantic storm, it was a hydraulic nightmare. Imagine a restroom that sometimes flushed itself in reverse. The smell hit first. Salt, oil, and human waste mixed with the constant tang of diesel. Add the faint sweetness of vomit inevitable after 3 days of rough weather, and you have the destroyer's signature scent. One sailor wrote in his diary, "The whole ship smells like bad chow and fear." Another described the heads as open-concept plumbing with built-in regret. Using them required both courage and timing. Veterans spoke of the art of the wave, learning to anticipate the roll of the ship so you didn't get an unpleasant surprise. You'd wait for the bow to dip, brace your legs against the bulkhead, and pray the next swell didn't send a gallon of seawater shooting back up the pipe. Outside, the wind shrieked across the deck at 40 knots. Inside, men clung to pipes, shouting over the mechanical roar of engines. The O'Brien's Westinghouse steam turbines turned at nearly 30,000 shaft horsepower, propelling the destroyer at over 35 knots when ordered to chase a contact. But during convoy duty, she ploughed along at a more cautious 15 knots, her bow slicing through waves the size of small buildings. Each impact reverberated through the entire hull. Plates clattered in the mess deck.
Men in bunks were tossed like laundry. Now imagine trying to unzip your trousers through all that. They said the Navy ran on coffee, not what came after it.
The truth was that caffeine and motion sickness didn't mix well. Navy doctors issued Dramamine tablets and ginger chews, but neither solved the basic physics of plumbing on a heaving ship. More than one unlucky sailor discovered that the sea, like bureaucracy, was happiest when it made you suffer twice. Destroyer life was a paradox of noise and monotony. For days, the crew might hear nothing but engines, wind, and the creak of steel. Then the sonar operator would report a contact, maybe a U-boat, maybe a whale, and suddenly every man was at battle stations, heart racing, bowels forgotten. But once the excitement passed, reality crept back in. The deck still rolled, the ship still smelled, and your stomach still reminded you that coffee has consequences. Veterans joked that a destroyer had 3 modes: fight, clean, or throw up. Cleaning the heads fell to the youngest crewmen, often called deck apes or snipe boys depending on their department.
Armed with stiff brushes, buckets of disinfectant, and little enthusiasm, they scrubbed down every surface while the ship rocked beneath them. Regulations demanded a spotless ship, even if the ocean was actively trying to destroy it. One petty officer liked to remind his men, cleanliness is next to godliness, and given this weather, you'll be meeting him soon enough. The constant dampness made everything feel slimy. Metal handrails dripped condensation, uniforms never dried completely, and boots squelched on the deck plates. Even sleeping was a balancing act. Bunks were stacked 3 high, each with a narrow canvas sling. When the ship rolled, you'd sway with it, the motion both soothing and nauseating. Sometimes you'd wake in the dark, unsure if you were still moving or if the world had stopped spinning. Compared to that, the head seemed like another dimension, noisy, bright, and always slightly terrifying. When the destroyer pitched forward, seawater could blow back through the pipes with the force of a fire hose. To counter it, sailors learned to flush only during upward motion, timing their effort with the rhythm of the waves. Get it wrong, and the results were immediate and humbling. Some kept spare socks for plumbing incidents. Others decided to wait until landfall, a decision that came with its own miseries. Convoy HX 186 stretched across the horizon, 47 merchant ships, each carrying fuel, munitions, or food for Britain. The destroyers circled them like anxious shepherd dogs. The North Atlantic was a battlefield that rarely slept.
Beneath those grey waves, German U-boats lurked, waiting for stragglers. Every splash could be a periscope. Every echo on sonar might be a torpedo. During one particularly rough night, a lookout reported phosphorescent trails in the water, possible torpedoes. The O'Brien went to full speed, heeling 30 degrees to port. Down below, the heads became a scene out of slapstick tragedy. Men grabbed onto pipes as seawater sloshed up to their ankles. One sailor later wrote, "We prayed not to get hit, but at that moment, we'd have welcomed a torpedo just to stop the rolling." When the ship steadied,
laughter spread through the compartment, half relief, half hysteria.
dark humour was as essential as oxygen. By day 5, the convoy was deep in the storm belt. The air temperature hovered around 38 degrees heat, but wind chill on the open deck made it feel near freezing. Salt spray crusted everything in a thin white glaze, including the forward gun mounts and, unfortunately, the pipes leading to the heads. The salt corroded valves so badly that they sometimes seized mid-flush, requiring a mallet to reset. Nothing about the system was elegant. Everything about it was loud. The smell lingered even in the mess deck. You could taste it in your food, diesel, salt, and steel. Yet somehow sailors adapted. The same way tankers learned to ignore heat and airmen learned to endure cold, destroyer crews accepted perpetual damp discomfort as the price of staying alive. Every few hours, someone would remark that the sea looked calmer. It never was. The North Atlantic didn't calm, it only paused to take a breath. When the next gale hit, waves climbed 20 feet above the bow, crashing down hard enough to make the hull shudder. Inside, loose gear clanged, coffee spilled, and men swore at the ship as though it were doing it on purpose. A modern comparison? It's like trying to use a bathroom on a roller coaster while someone sprays you with a garden hose filled with salt water. Even veterans admitted they never quite got used to it. That week, Convoy HX-186 made it through with minimal losses. The O'Brien detected 2 suspected submarines but never confirmed a kill. The real victory was survival. When the destroyer finally docked in Liverpool, the crew stepped onto the pier like men walking on clouds, their legs still subconsciously bracing for the next roll. Below decks, the engineers began their ritual inspection. They found cracked valves, corroded pipes, and one flooded compartment near the heads. The ship smelled of damp rubber and relief. Someone painted new graffiti on the bulkhead near the toilets, flush with faith. It became the running joke of the next voyage. When the ship rolled 20 degrees, even experienced sailors found religion. If you've ever used an airplane bathroom and felt a mild moment of panic when you pressed that button and heard the vacuum roar, you've had a tiny taste of naval engineering. Now imagine that same system built 80 years earlier, powered by salt water instead of electricity, prone to clogs and connected directly to the ocean. In other words, an accident waiting to happen. Life aboard a World War II destroyer wasn't just about radar screens and depth charges. It was about plumbing, complex temperamental plumbing that demanded respect. Sailors treated the ship's toilet system with the same wary reverence they gave to live ordnance, because both could ruin your day if handled wrong. On paper, the design was simple. The destroyer's heads used seawater flush systems powered by pressure differentials. Each toilet had a flushing valve connected to a seawater intake pipe that drew water in through the hull. The waste went down another pipe known as the discharge line and exited below the water line through an outlet valve. When the ship was moving smoothly, this worked fine. The flow of water created a natural siphon carrying everything neatly away. But if you flushed at the wrong time, say, when the bow dipped into a wave, the pressure outside the hull was greater than the pressure inside. That meant one thing, backflow. And when it came fast. Veterans called it Neptune's Revenge. To prevent accidents, destroyers were fitted with vacuum breakers, metal chambers, that interrupted the flow and equalized pressure. But wartime equipment rarely worked the way engineers imagined. Salt corrosion, rust, and human error conspired against the system. The heads were located forward on most ships near the bow, where wave impact was fiercest. That made them convenient targets for both the sea and poor timing. One sailor described the risk perfectly. You had to time it like a dance.
Open, flush, close,
prey. He wasn't exaggerating. The USS Buckley DE-51 recorded such an incident in 1943. A new recruit failed to secure the discharge valve before flushing during heavy seas. The resulting surge forced seawater back up through the entire line, flooding the compartment ankle-deep in cold Atlantic brine. The engineers spent hours pumping out the space and replacing corroded fittings. Officially, it was logged as minor water ingress. Unofficially, it became known as the Great Flush of Shame. The Royal Navy faced similar problems. On the HMS Harvester, a British destroyer escort, an engineer noted in his maintenance diary, improper use of heads resulted in 3 flooded compartments and the temporary demoralization of personnel. That's a remarkably polite way of saying the ship smelled like a wet sewer for a week. Even when the system behaved, the smell never quite left. Salt water carried organic decay with it, and every valve, every gasket reeked faintly of rot and diesel. Engineers used creosote, bleach and carbolic acid to clean the pipes, but these chemicals combined into a noxious perfume that could make your eyes water. Men learned to breathe shallowly and talk less while using the facilities. Some kept cigarettes tucked behind their ears, ready to light immediately afterward, not for relaxation, but as portable air fresheners. Sailors eventually developed a kind of ritualistic respect for the plumbing. You didn't mock the heads, you didn't rush them, and you never ignored the sound of gurgling water. If you heard a groan in the pipes, it meant pressure was building somewhere it shouldn't. That groan was your warning. Shipboard law grew around the system. The golden rule that passed from veteran to recruit was simple: never flush against the wind. In calm weather, the wind meant nothing more than the ship's direction through the sea. But in storms, the saying became literal. Heavy seas could whip up whirlpools of back pressure that pushed seawater up through the outflow valves. Flush during one of those moments, and the result was spectacular. Aboard the O'Brien, the engineers could identify which sailor had broken the rule without needing to ask. The evidence, as they put it, was self-presenting. They fixed leaks with pipe clamps and rubber patches, often improvising with whatever material was available. Replacement parts were rare, and the supply ships didn't prioritize toilet valves when delivering torpedoes and ammunition. A chief machinist's mate on the O'Brien once remarked, "We could rebuild a turbine with chewing gum and prayer, but give us a leaky head and we were helpless." He wasn't far off. The plumbing blueprints looked simple until you traced them through 3 decks, 12 valves, and half a mile of pipe twisting through bulkheads. To most sailors, though, the system's inner workings remained mysterious, an invisible network that only revealed itself through failure. When things went wrong, the results were immediate and memorable. The best documented incident occurred aboard the USS Buckley again in late 1944, while escorting convoy UGS-42. A clog in the forward discharge line caused pressure to build until a gasket blew out, spraying waste and seawater across the compartment. The mess deck directly below had to be evacuated. Official damage report: sanitary failure due to operational misuse. Translation: someone flushed at the wrong time. Humor, as always, was the only defense. The engineering crew painted a sign near the door reading, "One man's flush is another man's flood." The absurdity of the system became part of shipboard culture. Engineers explained it to new recruits with the same seriousness as torpedo drills. There was even an unofficial ceremony. On your first successful flush without backflow, you'd get a handshake and a mock promotion to qualified seaman, first class in sanitary operations. A British sailor aboard HMS Harvester joked, "They gave us the best navy in the world and toilets designed by Satan." Modern comparison? It was like using a high-tech airplane lavatory, except it could explode, it smelled like diesel, and it occasionally shouted back. But beneath the laughter was real respect. The destroyer was a living system of valves, pumps, and pressure differentials. Each one mattered. The same seawater that cooled the engines and fed the boilers also powered the toilets. Failed to balance the pressures, and the entire ship suffered. In storms, when the hull flexed and pipes rattled, engineers would patrol with wrenches, tightening couplings by feel. They could tell by vibration alone whether a valve was seated properly. These men didn't get medals, but without them, Even the simplest human needs could turn catastrophic at the end of each voyage. When the O'Brien docked for refit, the engineers drained and flushed the sanitary system with fresh water. The first wave of clean water always turned black. It was a strangely satisfying ritual, the ship taking a long breath after weeks of holding it in. The smell of bleach filled the corridors. The crew grumbled but smiled, knowing it meant solid ground was near. The engineers, half joking, called it absolution by plumbing. Over time, sailors developed coping mechanisms. Some avoided the heads entirely during heavy seas, using buckets in secluded corners instead. Others created an unofficial roster of safe flushers men who seemed to have a knack for getting the timing right. Rumour held that one chief petty officer on the Buckley could predict the next roll by listening to the vibration of the hull. Whether true or not, he was in high demand. Superstition met science in the most mundane way imaginable. The plumbing became a teacher of patience, rhythm, and humility. It reminded everyone daily that no amount of naval discipline could overcome the whims of the sea. In the long nights between convoy alarms, when the engines thrummed and the deck pitched underfoot, the ship's plumbing sang its own strange symphony. The hiss of valves, the gurgle of trapped air, the deep groan of pipes flexing with the hull, all became part of the background music of survival. Sailors swore the pipes had personalities, some friendly, some vindictive. You learned to recognize them like crewmates. When one hissed too long, you got up to check on it.
Because you knew what came next if you didn't. The pipes groaned.
The sea slammed, and one unlucky sailor forgot the golden rule: never flush against the wind. You know that feeling when you can't sleep because of the hum of your refrigerator or the ticking of a clock. But after a while you stop hearing it. That's what life sounded like aboard a destroyer at night, except the hum was a pair of Westinghouse steam turbines spinning at 30,000 revolutions per minute, and the clock was the ocean itself. The day's chaos faded with the sunset. The convoy had settled into its steady rhythm again, 47 merchant ships crawling eastward through the North Atlantic, each one glowing faintly in the mist, each one depending on the escorts to keep the wolves at bay. The storm had passed, leaving a long rolling swell that made the deck sway like a cradle. The sky was black velvet, the kind that swallowed the horizon. Night watch began at 2200 hours 10 o'clock for anyone not fluent in Navy time. The ship divided into 4-hour shifts called watches. Every man had his turn. The system kept the destroyer alive around the clock. Engineers minding gauges below, lookouts scanning the dark horizon, signalmen watching for Morse flashes. The air temperature hovered just above freezing, and the wind cut through even the thick pea coats issued to sailors. Every surface gleamed with a thin film of frost. Boots crunched softly on the deck as men shuffled to their stations. Breath fogged in the lamplight. The O'Brien's deck was a world of sound and texture, the rhythmic slap of waves against steel, the distant whine of turbines, the rattle of loose chains, and somewhere below, the steady hiss of steam. Every so often the sea found its way aboard a sudden spray over the bow that soaked everything and froze before it could drip. You didn't walk on a destroyer's deck. You braced, swayed, and prayed you wouldn't slip. Below decks the air was thick and warm, smelling of oil, metal, and bodies. The heads, mercifully, had quieted for the night. Few dared use them in rough seas after dark. The engineers called the lingering odour nautical aromatherapy. It was part bleach, part brine, part despair. Some said it reminded them of home, though no one ever explained how. Coffee was the ship's true fuel. The galley never stopped brewing in it. The Navy's official supply manual specified 1 pound of grounds per 12 men per day, but most ships ignored that entirely. The O'Brien's crew averaged double. The smell of burnt coffee mingled with diesel exhaust until you couldn't tell where caffeine ended and carbon began. A mug of hot coffee on a freezing deck felt like treasure. Men cupped their hands around it, absorbing the warmth more than drinking the liquid. They joked that the coffee was strong enough to strip paint, but no one ever refused it. In truth, it was the closest thing to comfort they had. During quiet stretches, the ship moved like a living creature groaning. breathing, whispering through the waves. You could feel it in your bones. The deck flexed slightly with each swell, as if inhaling and exhaling. Some men said the O'Brien had moods, calm 1 hour, irritable the next. You learn to read them like you read the weather. Every few minutes, a lookout called down from the bridge with a status report. Usually it was nothing, all clear. Convoy steady. Occasionally the word contact would echo through the ship, sending a shiver through everyone awake. Then came the tense silence while the sonar crew listened. 99 times out of 100, it was nothing more than a whale, a drifting oil drum, or the ocean playing tricks. But that one time it wasn't kept everyone sharp. Fear was constant but quiet. It wasn't movie-style panic. It was a low, steady vibration under the skin. You learned to live with it like background noise. In the mess deck, the off-duty men gathered around dim red lamps, playing cards or just staring at the table, letting the engine's vibration lull them. Laughter broke out easily, but never lasted long. The jokes were old, repeated nightly, but somehow still funny. Did you hear they're serving steak tomorrow?
Sure, soon as the cows learned to swim, a little humour kept the cold away.
It wasn't about being funny, it was about reminding each other they were still human. Letters from home were currency. When mail came aboard, it was read until the paper turned soft from folding. Some letters smelled faintly of perfume, which seemed almost alien in the world of salt and metal. A few men kept photos pinned near their bunks.
Others didn't, claiming it made it harder to focus.
Everyone had their rituals. Cleaning stations filled the time between watches. There was always something to scrub decks, handrails, the endless battle against rust. The Navy's obsession with cleanliness wasn't just about discipline, it was survival. Saltwater was relentless, and any negligence could turn a bolt to powder. Even in freezing weather, sailors chipped away at corrosion with gloved hands, muttering curses and humming tunes. There's something almost meditative about cleaning steel in the dark, the way the brush strokes sync with the motion of the sea. A destroyer demanded attention like a living thing, and its crew obliged without question. Convoy HX-186 made steady progress. Out of 47 merchant ships, only one fell behind, and even that one limped safely into port days later. The Allies had learned hard lessons since 1941, when nearly 1 in 5 ships never made it across. By mid-1942, improved radar, sonar, and coordination meant the odds had tipped slightly in favor of survival, but slightly was the keyword. The North Atlantic still claimed lives weekly. The cold itself could kill faster than enemy fire. Fall overboard in those waters, and you had less than 5 minutes before unconsciousness. Crews drilled constantly to retrieve man overboard. Though everyone knew the chances were slim, it created a strange kind of intimacy. You might not know your bunkmate's middle name, but you'd risk your life pulling him out of the sea. That's what bound crews together shared vulnerability. Around midnight, the ship's loudspeakers crackled softly with the voice of the officer of the deck. All hands, stand by for course correction, 10 degrees to starboard. A few groans answered from below decks. Boots thudded, wrenches clanked. The ship leaned as it adjusted its heading. Then, silence again, save for the hum of the turbines and the gentle slap of water. The rhythm resumed. In those hours, time lost meaning. The sea and sky merged into one vast grey void. The ship might have been floating through space for all anyone could tell. Some men found it soothing, even beautiful. Others found it maddening. One veteran from the USS O'Brien years later described it like this. You'd stand on deck at night and realize how small you were. Just you, the ship, and the cold. But then someone beside you would make a joke about coffee or the smell, and suddenly it wasn't so lonely. That smell always there, faint but persistent. Diesel, salt, sweat, bleach, it clung to everything. Sailors joked it was the Navy's version of cologne. Oh, the destroyer. Some claimed they could still smell it decades later whenever they passed a harbour. They called it nautical aromatherapy, the scent of discipline, discomfort, and diesel. You either got used to it or went mad trying. By over 400 hours, the sky began to lighten a dull silver glow spreading across the waves. Another watch ended, another began. The men rotated, bleary-eyed, rubbing their faces with cold hands. Someone brewed a fresh pot of coffee so strong it could probably run the engines. A boatswain blew his whistle for morning cleaning stations. Routine swallowed exhaustion. The sea, indifferent and endless, kept rolling beneath them. Convoy HX 186 would reach Liverpool 3 days later. There'd be fresh bread, mail, and a few hours of solid ground before they sailed again. The cycle never really stopped. The Navy called it endurance. The men called it just another crossing. The destroyer's turbines hummed, the ocean breathed, and somewhere below decks the pipes still gurgled faintly the eternal heartbeat of the ship. Above, sailors leaned on the rails, sipping coffee gone cold, watching the sunrise paint the grey water gold. It wasn't peace, exactly, but it was something close. The Atlantic took men and ships, but it also took their dignity, one toilet flush at a time. You know that feeling when you go camping and realize you forgot the toilet paper? Now imagine it's 20 below zero, artillery is falling in the distance, and the nearest restroom is a hole you had to dig yourself. That was daily life for the men of the 101st Airborne Division during the Battle of the Bulge. December 1944, like camping but with artillery. By the time the 101st reached Bastogne, Belgium winter had sunk its teeth into Europe. The forests around the town were buried in snow 2 feet deep, and the temperature dropped to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit at night. Weapons froze.
Rations froze.
Even coffee froze, leaving a layer of ice that had to be chipped away before heating. And yet, somehow, nature didn't freeze. For the soldiers of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment and 502nd Parachute Infantry, sanitation became as critical as ammunition. The Army manuals had entire sections on field latrine procedure, complete with diagrams and recommended depths. The problem? The manuals didn't account for frozen ground. When the men dug in, they really dug in. Each position required a foxhole roughly 6 feet long, 2 feet wide and 3 feet deep, but nearby there was always a smaller hole for another kind of business. Officially it was called a cat hole. Unofficially, soldiers gave it names not printable in regulations. A proper latrine trench was supposed to be 1 foot wide, 4 feet deep, and long enough for several men, spaced 10 yards from the nearest foxhole, to prevent contamination. In the mud of Normandy that summer, it had been easy enough. In Bastogne's frozen earth, it was an engineering challenge worthy of the cause of engineers. Men used bayonets, entrenching tools, even broken helmets to chip away at the permafrost. Some resorted to starting small fires just to thaw the surface enough to dig. The effort burned more calories than the meager rations could replace. The smell was the least of their problems. Snow muffled sound but not odor, and the bitter wind carried it across the lines. Veterans joked that the Germans probably knew where American positions were just by following their noses. There was lime powder, at least in theory. Army sanitation kits included chlorinated lime, sprinkled after each use to neutralize waste. But by December, resupply convoys had stopped. The 101st was surrounded. Lime became a myth, along with soap and dry socks, so men improvised. They covered holes with snow or burned scraps of wood. Some poured leftover coffee or melted snow to keep things from freezing solid. It didn't help much. As one paratrooper later put it, everything froze but us. You couldn't blame the Army for trying. The Field Manual FM 21-10 outlined sanitation procedures down to the inch. It recommended that latrines be downhill from camp and at least 100 yards from any water source. But Bastogne wasn't a camp. It was a siege. The front lines shifted by the hour, and men relieved themselves wherever they could behind logs, inside ruined houses, even in discarded German helmets. A few veterans remembered using empty sea ration tins, a grim echo of the tankers' coffee cans back in Normandy. The difference was that at least tank crews were warm. It was the kind of discomfort too mundane for war movies, but too unforgettable to ignore. Men talked about it the way civilians talk about bad weather, half complaint, half badge of honor. The cold made everything harder. Fingers went numb within minutes of exposure. Belts and suspenders froze stiff. Trying to unbutton layers of wool and canvas in sub-zero wind was a small exercise in pain. More than one man learned the hard way that metal zippers and bare skin don't mix. There were rules, of course, written and unwritten. You didn't go alone. You didn't wander far. Sniper fire didn't stop for bathroom breaks. And you never ever left your rifle behind. Some units dug group latrines lined with wooden planks scavenged from barns. Others used old ammunition crates labeled explosives with a touch of irony. One soldier from the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, Private Ed Reynolds, wrote in his diary, "It's a strange thing when you're more afraid of frostbite than artillery. You hurry, not because of the enemy, but because the cold hurts too much to stand still." Humour became the best insulation. They called it digging in, and they weren't wrong. One GI told a war correspondent that he'd dug more holes for one thing than for the other. Another swore the army's motto should be changed to "hurry up and wait."
And dig. The shared misery bred a kind of solidarity.
You couldn't stay embarrassed when everyone smelled the same and froze together. It wasn't pretty, but it was honest. At night, the snow sparkled under flares, and the forest fell silent except for the distant thump of artillery. The foxholes were lined with canvas and straw when they could find it, though most men slept on frozen mud. Sometimes they burned a little fuel in tin cans for heat. The warmth was fleeting. The smoke wasn't. The same snow that offered cover also became a curse. When it melted, it exposed everything buried beneath, including the necessities. That was tomorrow's problem. Rations didn't help either. The K rations were compact, efficient, and guaranteed to keep things moving. They contained biscuits, powdered coffee, tinned meat, and a small square of toilet paper, 4 sheets to be precise. It was a cruel joke. Most men used old letters or pages from German propaganda leaflets instead. The army encouraged burning waste when possible, both for hygiene and morale. Fire was rare warmth, even if its purpose was less than poetic. But smoke drew attention, and every spark risked giving away a position. So more often than not, the soldiers just buried everything and hoped the ground stayed frozen. Imagine camping in your backyard during a blizzard, surrounded by artillery noise, eating cold meat from a can.
And trying to dig through ice with a spoon.
That's the picture. For all the discomfort, it's what they remembered decades later. Not the firefights or the medals, but the absurd little routines that defined their days. One veteran told an interviewer in the 1980s, "We were all tough guys until we needed to take a leak. Then we were philosophers." Another remembered that even in the coldest nights, laughter echoed through the trees. If you didn't laugh, you'd go nuts. Sometimes we joked the Germans had better bathrooms. In truth, they probably didn't. The Wehrmacht troops across the lines faced the same frozen misery. Diaries from German infantrymen in the 26th Volksgrenadier Division describe identical struggles, improvised latrines, frozen ground, and the constant battle between discipline and biology.
Misery, it turned out, was bilingual. By late December, the siege of Bastogne tightened.
Supplies dwindled, sanitation worsened, and disease threatened to do what the Germans couldn't. Dysentery and trench foot spread quietly through the ranks. The medics worked miracles with what little they had, mainly soap, snow, and determination. Yet, despite it all, the men endured. They found comfort in routine, however grim. Morning meant scraping ice from rifles. Noon meant cold rations. Evening meant shivering under blankets that smelled faintly of wood smoke and sweat. And sometime during the endless night, each man faced the same problem: how to answer nature's call without freezing to death or getting shot. When historians describe Bastogne, they talk about strategy, the encirclement, the defense, the relief by Patton's Third Army. But the soldiers who were there remember the small things: the sound of boots crunching in snow, the smell of wood fires, the pain of frostbitten fingers fumbling with buttons. War wasn't just fought with bullets. It was fought with blisters, bad food, and frozen ground. And, in those forests of Belgium, even the simplest act of survival became an act of endurance. When the snow froze solid, so did the problem. You know that feeling when you get a small blister and it stings like it's the end of the world? Now imagine that blister turning black, spreading up your leg while you're sitting in a frozen foxhole surrounded by enemy artillery. Welcome to the other front of the Battle of the Bulge, the one fought not with bullets, but with bacteria, frost, and filth. By late December 1944, Bastogne had become a frozen island of misery. The 101st Airborne Division was surrounded, supply lines cut, and medical units overwhelmed. The wounded filled every cellar, barn, and church in the town. But even those unhit by shrapnel or bullets were falling victim to a slower, meaner enemy, sanitation failure. It started small, runny noses, coughs, upset stomachs. Then came the fevers, the cramps, the bleeding. The US Army's medical department later estimated that by the end of the siege, non-combat illness accounted for almost 40% of total casualties. Most of it came down to one simple fact: there was no way to stay clean. The field manuals had predicted this. FM 2110 Military Sanitation and First Aid warned that inadequate hygiene and excreta disposal are among the greatest causes of manpower loss. But in Bastogne, you couldn't exactly ask the Germans for a truce to dig a proper latrine. Water was the key problem. It froze solid overnight, and melting snow took time, fuel, and patience, three things in short supply. Each squad had one or two small gasoline stoves, usually reserved for heating rations. But men soon discovered that snow makes terrible drinking water unless boiled. Otherwise, it carried dirt, soot, and germs. So they got creative. Step 1, collect snow in a mess tin or helmet. Step 2, light a ration stove if you were lucky enough to have fuel. Step 3, wait. It took 10 minutes to melt enough for a single canteen, and the result tasted faintly of smoke and desperation. For hygiene, men used melted snow to wipe their faces or rinse hands after meals. A few even shaved with it briefly before frostbite convinced them otherwise. But when it came to sanitation, melting snow wasn't enough. The real challenge was waste. Latrines were shallow trenches when they could be dug at all. The ground was rock hard. Most holes filled up quickly, and no one had the strength to keep digging.
Overflow became inevitable.
Snow covered everything, disguising the hazards. Then came the thaw, followed by an outbreak of dysentery that hit like a second enemy attack. The symptoms were miserable: fever, cramps, dehydration, and a desperate need for a place to go when there were no places left. A medic from the 326th Airborne Medical Company wrote in his notes, "Our biggest challenge isn't bullets, it's bowel movements." He wasn't joking. Improvised solutions popped up everywhere. Soldiers repurposed ration tins, ammunition boxes, and even steel helmets as makeshift toilets. After use, they buried or burned the contents whenever possible. Some poured fuel over it to mask the smell, others simply set it alight. There's something humbling about watching a man salute a burning helmet full of waste because it's the only fire around. One officer dryly remarked, "We've invented the self-heating latrine. It's not efficient, but it's warm." Dark humor like that kept men sane. As one veteran said later, some men feared latrines more than mortars. The cold did help in one way: it slowed bacterial growth. But that didn't mean the human body cooperated. Frostbite crept in silently. It started as tingling in the toes, then numbness, then black skin. Frostbite cases overwhelmed medics just as much as gunshot wounds. Men who removed their boots to check their feet risked losing feeling altogether. To counter it, soldiers rubbed their feet with anti-frost ointment, swapped socks when possible, and slept with boots half loosened. But the frozen ground stole heat faster than the body could produce it. According to the Surgeon General's report for 1945, frostbite and trench foot accounted for nearly 15,000 casualties in the Ardennes campaign alone. Trench foot was its own special misery. It wasn't caused by cold directly, but by prolonged exposure to damp conditions. The combination of sweat, melting snow, and tight boots turned feet into pale, swollen lumps. When soldiers finally removed their socks, the skin often peeled away with them. The smell was unforgettable. Medics instructed men to massage their feet daily and dry them by any means available, usually over candle stubs or the faint warmth of a Jeep engine. But fuel was scarce and body heat was rationed. One squad rotated boots. Half wore them while the other half tried to dry theirs by the fire. It was teamwork at its most desperate. Diseases thrived in this environment. Lice, fleas, and intestinal parasites became constant companions. Bathing was a fantasy. Washing hands was a luxury. Food came from tins handled by dirty gloves and eaten with spoons wiped on equally dirty sleeves. Yet somehow, discipline held. The Army's obsession with cleanliness, drilled into every recruit from basic training, left a kind of muscle memory. Even without supplies, men still scraped mud from boots, brushed teeth with snow, and wiped down rifles as though cleanliness could hold chaos at bay. It couldn't, but it helped. In the cellars of Bastogne, the field hospitals overflowed. The 326th Airborne Medical Company, working from the basement of a convent, treated everything from shrapnel wounds to gangrene. Supplies ran out quickly. Surgeons operated with kitchen knives sterilized over makeshift stoves. Bandages were washed and reused until they disintegrated. According to records from Surgeon Colonel Charles R. Odom, the medics handled 200 wounded and 600 cases of disease during the siege. One nurse later recalled, "We ran out of morphine, penicillin, and clean water, but never out of patients. They even treated frostbite by rubbing snow on affected limbs, not because it worked, but because it was all they had." Sometimes the medics used humor as anesthesia. They named one corner of the hospital the spa. Soldiers coming in for treatment were greeted with mock cheer. "Welcome to Bastogne's finest resort, heated floors optional." One private who'd lost half his foot to frostbite joked that he'd saved on shoe polish for life. Laughter hurt, but it was better than silence. As January approached, the siege began to lift. Patton's Third Army was pushing north, bringing supplies and relief, but the damage had been done. The survivors of Bastogne looked more like refugees than soldiers, hollow-eyed, pale, wrapped in whatever they could find. Many had lost toes or fingers. Others carried infections that would last months. Yet when the medics compared the numbers, a grim irony appeared. Far more men had fallen to cold, hunger, and disease than to German bullets. According to after-action reports, illness and exposure caused twice as many evacuations as combat wounds during the Bulge. War wasn't just fought in the trenches, it was fought in the bloodstream. After the battle, the Army Medical Corps studied the data obsessively. They introduced new insulated boots, redesigned rations, and emphasized sanitation training. But for the men who'd lived through Bastogne, the lessons had already been written in frostbite scars and dysentery cramps. One veteran put it simply, "We learned that the enemy could be the cold, the mud, or your own stomach. But you fight them the same way, one miserable day at a time." When historians talk about the Battle of the Bulge, they describe it as the last great German offensive. But the soldiers who endured it remember something else, the constant ache of cold feet, the sour taste of snow water, the way laughter echoed in the dark just to remind you you were still alive. In the end, survival wasn't about bravery. It was about hygiene, humor, and habit. You washed when you could, joked when you couldn't, and prayed your stomach behaved when the shells started again. When the snow melted, the foxholes would reveal the true toll-rusted tins, scorched helmets, and shallow pits filled with reminders that even heroes had to go. The latrine line was as deadly as the front line. You know that feeling after a long camping trip when you pack up. Look back at the empty spot where your tent was, and it's just dirt and footprints. Multiply that by a war, and you'll start to picture what the forests around Bastogne looked like after the Battle of the Bulge. The snow had melted, the silence had returned, but the ground still remembered. When the 101st Airborne Division finally pulled out in late January 1945, the landscape they left behind looked more like a moonscape than a forest. Tree trunks splintered by artillery stood like broken matchsticks. The snow was grey with soot and ash. Empty K-ration tins, twisted bits of equipment, and scorched foxholes dotted the fields, and everywhere there were holes. Some had held men. Others had held something less noble. After the battle, Army field sanitation units moved in behind the infantry to do what soldiers couldn't while fighting: clean up. Their reports were methodical, almost cold in tone. One from the Army Medical Department, dated February 2nd, 1945, noted latrines were shallow, irregular, and frequently frozen solid. Several instances of contamination observed near bivouac areas. Lime resupply insufficient. Translated from bureaucratic English, that meant the place smelled like a nightmare. The clean-up teams were often made up of medics, engineers, and supply clerks, men who weren't supposed to be on the front lines, but ended up in the aftermath anyway. They worked with shovels, buckets, and barrels of lime powder. It wasn't glamorous work,
but it was vital.
Disease could spread faster than rumor, and with spring approaching, sanitation wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about survival for the next units moving through. Imagine being handed a shovel and told, "Congratulations, Private, you're saving lives by cleaning the latrines of history." One engineer described it as burying the evidence of human endurance. The process was methodical. Step 1, identify contaminated areas. Step 2, dig them deeper or cover with lime. Step 3, burn whatever could burn. Step 4, mark the area with a white flag to warn others not to dig there again. It was grim, necessary, and oddly symbolic, purging the last traces of siege life. Among the frozen foxholes, they found everything from discarded toothbrushes to melted tin cups. The mundane things told the truest stories. One shovel turned up a bar of soap, still wrapped, frozen into the earth, a little square of good intentions that never got used. Despite the filth and exhaustion, there was a strange peace in the work. The shooting had stopped. The only sounds were the scrape of shovels and the drip of melting snow. Some soldiers said it felt like cleaning up after a storm that had hit the entire world. Others just wanted to get through it without gagging. The smell of lime powder filled the air, a sharp chemical scent that clung to uniforms. It mixed with the odors of smoke, damp earth, and decay, creating what one medic called the fragrance of victory. A dark joke, maybe, but an honest one. The Army's obsession with sanitation didn't come from nowhere. In World War I, more men had died from disease than from enemy fire. By 1945, the US military had turned cleanliness into doctrine. Every battalion had designated sanitation officers. Every field manual contained pages on latrine design, garbage disposal, and hand washing even in combat. It might seem absurd to think of toilets as strategy, but history proved otherwise. Clean water and proper waste disposal saved more lives than some weapons ever did. The men in Bastogne hadn't had those luxuries, but they survived anyway, improvising with what little they had. In a war that was supposed to be about tanks and tactics, the humble shovel was still one of the most important tools in the field. When General Patton's troops broke through to relieve Bastogne, they were hit first, not by gunfire, but by the smell. Days of confinement, burned refuse, and unburied waste had turned the snow into a biological minefield. The rescuers joked that they didn't need maps, they just followed their noses, but they also noticed something else. Despite everything, the foxholes were tidy. The men of the 101st had kept their positions clean, their weapons maintained, and their routines intact. Even in siege conditions, discipline had survived. That kind of order in the middle of chaos wasn't just hygiene, it was defiance. Veterans later spoke about the strange comfort of routine. You couldn't control the weather or the shells or whether the next resupply plane would make it through, but you could control your little patch of ground. You could dig, scrape, clean, and keep it ready. That small ritual of control, washing a tin cup, brushing snow off a rifle, burying waste, became a lifeline. Psychologists now call that adaptive behavior. Back then, it was just common sense. A private from the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, decades later, summed it up. You couldn't keep your hands clean, but you could keep your mind clean by doing something that made sense. even digging a latrine. After the war, the army studied the sanitation practices of Bastogne and wrote new procedures for winter campaigns. They introduced portable chemical toilets for Arctic operations and improved disinfectants that wouldn't freeze. Engineers even redesigned field rations to reduce packaging waste because fewer cans meant fewer disposal problems. It was a small, bureaucratic kind of progress, but progress nonetheless. In modern armies, every field base has mobile latrine units, waste incinerators, and trained sanitation specialists. Soldiers today rarely have to worry about frozen ground or dysentery, but the principles remain the same. Clean water, clean hands, clean camps save lives. Bastogne's suffering wasn't forgotten, it was turned into policy. If you walk the forests around Bastogne today, you can still find traces.
Metal fragments, rusted helmets, even old latrine trenches softened by time.
Local historians say that after the thaw in spring 1945, the ground bloomed early, fertilized in the strangest way by human endurance. The forest has grown back, the foxholes have filled in. But if you look closely, you can still see the faint depressions in the earth where men once dug for survival. Some call them scars, others call them memorials. It's humbling to think that the most human mark left on that battlefield wasn't a bullet hole, it was a shovel's edge. For the soldiers who survived, cleanliness became a lifelong habit. Veterans were known to wash their hands compulsively or keep immaculate workspaces. Some joked about post-war sanitation syndrome, but it wasn't about dirt, it was about control, order, the small rituals that had kept them sane. When asked decades later what they remembered most,
few mentioned glory, most mentioned smell.
The mix of wet wool, gun oil, smoke, and human sweat. One old paratrooper laughed and said, "If heaven doesn't smell like soap, I'm not staying." As the snow melted in early 1945, the cleanup teams finished their work. They packed up their shovels, burned their last barrels of lime, and moved east toward Germany. Behind them lay fields of churned mud and quiet graves. The war rolled on, as wars do, but the ground they left behind had been reclaimed from chaos. One latrine, one trench, one breath of clean air at a time. When people think of the Battle of the Bulge, they picture tanks locked in combat and frozen soldiers in white camouflage. But the true story is smaller, humbler, and maybe more honest. Men fighting for inches, for warmth, for a clean place to stand. They weren't just defending Bastogne, they were defending a sense of normalcy, of civilization, in a world that had gone mad. They fought for miles of front line and for a few square feet of frozen earth. They fought for inches and for the right to dig a proper latrine. You know how your car refuses to start on a cold morning and you sit there turning the key while your breath fogs up the windshield? Now imagine that car is a 47-ton tank. The air outside is minus 30 degrees Celsius, and the only way to warm the engine is by setting a small fire underneath it. Welcome to the Eastern Front, winter of 1942, where even machines shivered. The KV-1 heavy tank was supposed to be the pride of Soviet engineering, a rolling fortress of steel that the Germans called impenetrable. It weighed 47 tons, carried 90 millimeters of armor, and mounted a 76.2 meter F-34 gun capable of tearing through a Panzer III like a tin can. But none of those numbers helped when the mercury dropped and everything, including the crew's rations, froze solid. Inside, 5 men shared a space smaller than a kitchen. The tank commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator mechanic lived and fought shoulder to shoulder in an iron box that smelled like oil, sweat, and despair. The air was so cold that when they exhaled, their breath condensed on the walls and froze there in thin white sheets. By morning, the interior looked like a miniature glacier. They called the tank Żelazная Bania, the iron sauna. The joke was dark because in winter it was anything but warm. It's December 1942 near Klin, northwest of Moscow. The Red Army has pushed the Germans back after the winter counter-offensive, but victory is a relative term. The ground is frozen solid, the rivers crusted with ice, and supply lines barely functioning. The KV-1 crews are running on fumes literally. Starting a tank in this weather is an ordeal. The V2K diesel engine refuses to crank below 10 degrees C. At 30 degrees C, it's impossible without heat. So crews build small fires under the engine block using gasoline-soaked rags or wood scavenged from nearby fences. The smell of burning oil fills the air. The trick is to warm the block without melting the fuel lines or setting the tank on fire. It's a delicate balance between ignition and incineration. Veterans recalled that every morning began with the same ritual: scrape frost from the periscope, check that the oil wasn't solid, and pray the starter would cough to life. Some said the engine groaned like a dying bear before finally catching. Others swore they could feel it sigh in relief. Inside, the KV-1 offered little comfort. The crew wore sheepskin coats, wool gloves and padded boots, but the cold still seeped through. The steel hull acted like a refrigerator. Men sat on folded blankets to keep from freezing to the metal benches. The tank's heating system was theoretical hot engine air routed into the fighting compartment. In practice, it barely worked. They learned to breathe slowly because exhaling too much condensed water vapor, which then froze on their eyebrows, mustaches, and even eyelashes. By midday, they looked like frost-covered statues. Rations came in tins: stewed meat, tushonka, black bread, and frozen potatoes. Sometimes they'd thaw a tin of meat by placing it near the engine block. Other times they just ate it frozen, slicing chunks off with a knife. It was less a meal and more a chore. Water came from melted snow. You filled a metal cup, set it near the exhaust vent, and waited. It took an hour. The resulting water tasted like carbon and rust, but it was better than nothing. Hygiene, of course, was a luxury. Soap was rare, water rarer, and privacy non-existent. The tankers used handfuls of snow for washing face, hands, even teeth, if they were feeling optimistic. A few drops of melted water on a rag were enough to feel civilized. Some crews claimed that rubbing snow on your skin woke up the blood. Others said it just made you colder. Both were right. One Soviet tanker later joked, "Even the fleas froze." It was the only silver lining. The Red Army had long struggled with lice infestations, but the cold finally did what no disinfectant could. For a few brief months, the itching stopped. The men took it as a victory. The KV-1's interior wasn't just cold, it was alive with sound.
Every creak of the armor, every groan of the transmission, every rattle of loose ammunition echoed through the steel shell.
The noise became background music, a mechanical heartbeat that filled the silence. Outside, the snow muffled all other sounds, turning the world into a frozen vacuum. The driver sat hunched over the controls, gloved hands gripping levers that froze to the touch. The gearbox, lubricated with oil that had the consistency of butter, moved grudgingly. Each gear change was a negotiation. The engine roared, the tracks bit into the ice, and the tank crawled forward at 10 kilometers per hour, slower than a man on skis. The Germans might have feared the KV-1's armor, but the real enemy was the temperature. In the brief pauses between movements, the crew tried to warm themselves by any means available. They burned scraps of wood in small stoves outside the tank, cupping hands around the meager flame. They smoked cigarettes until their lips cracked. They even sang to stay awake. Soviet songs, slow, melancholy tunes about home, springtime, and bread. There was a kind of poetry in their misery, a bond born not of glory, but of shared discomfort. In letters home, soldiers rarely mentioned combat.
They talked about cold, always cold.
One tanker wrote to his wife, "When I sleep, I dream of heat, not the sun, but a stove."
A stove and soup. The physical toll was brutal.
Frostbite took toes, fingers, and sometimes whole feet. Hands cracked until they bled. The smell of engine oil mixed with blood and diesel smoke created an odor that clung to everything, the perfume of the front, as one mechanic called it. Every movement was slow, deliberate, measured. You didn't waste energy. You didn't talk much. Breath froze mid-sentence. And yet, the KV-1s kept fighting. They ambushed convoys, supported infantry, and sometimes simply sat motionless for days, camouflaged under snow, engines running periodically just to keep from freezing solid. When fuel ran out, they abandoned the tanks, burying the engines under snow so the Germans couldn't salvage them. Sometimes they burned them instead, a sad, smouldering farewell to the machines that had carried them through hell. The human body adjusted in strange ways. Hunger dulled after the third day of half rations. Sleep came in short bursts, often leaning against the turret wall. The tank became both home and prison. Some crews marked time by the sound of distant artillery, others by their own rituals, scraping ice off the walls, refilling oil lamps, or melting snow for tea. Routine was survival. Without it, the mind wandered too far into hopelessness. There was humor too dry, bitter, but necessary. When the air froze so completely that you could hear the crack of a rifle echo for miles, one loader muttered, "At least the fascists are freezing too." Another replied, "Yes, but they have schnapps." Laughter warmed nothing, but it reminded them they were still alive. The KV-1 crews became legends in Soviet propaganda, portrayed as indestructible heroes battling both enemy and nature. The reality was humbler, men fighting mechanical failure, hunger, and their own frozen limbs. But maybe that was the truer kind of courage, the quiet endurance that didn't make headlines. By the end of December, temperatures plunged to 35 degrees. Even gun oil froze. The tanks creaked like icebergs. The landscape turned white and silent, except for the occasional groan of an engine trying to turn over. When the sun rose, it cast a pale orange glow over the snowfields, catching on the frost-covered hulls of abandoned KV-1s. They looked less like weapons and more like monuments, silent witnesses to human stubbornness. Inside the ones still running, 5 men sat in the dim half-light of dawn, wrapped in layers of wool and hope. And if you touched the seat without thinking, your skin would stick to it instantly. The only thing colder than the steel was the seat. You know that feeling when your phone battery dies in the cold and you try to warm it in your hands like it's a tiny, frozen pet? Now imagine your phone weighs 47 tons, burns diesel instead of electricity, and has to start before sunrise, or you and your crew might not live to see another day. That was life for Soviet tankers in the winter of 1942, a daily battle not against Germans, but against physics. The KV-1, for all its legendary armor, wasn't designed for a world where even the air seemed frozen. The V2K diesel engine, a 12-cylinder monster producing 600 horsepower, needed warmth to run. At 30 degrees, diesel turned into sludge. The oil inside the crankcase thickened like tar. Starting procedures became rituals. First, check that the block heater still worked. If it didn't, step 2, crawl underneath and light a wood or gasoline fire beneath the engine. Crews built makeshift braziers out of ration tins, filled them with kindling, and prayed that the flames warmed the metal without setting off the fumes. Once the block felt warm to the touch, usually after 20 minutes, the next challenge began. Hand cranking. Yes, hand cranking a tank. The KV's massive flywheel could, in theory, be started manually using a steel crank handle that fit into a small port in the rear armor plate. It took 2 men, sometimes 3, to turn it fast enough. They'd take shifts, rotating like human starter motors, their gloves stiff with frost. Each failed attempt drained more energy than calories could replace. When the engine finally coughed to life, it wasn't a roar of victory. It was a sickly, uneven growl that vibrated through every bone. But that sound meant heat, and heat meant life. Inside, the men sat hunched in their layers, waiting for the air to warm enough to breathe without pain. Condensation from their breath formed frost on every surface, guns, optics, even the control levers. They wiped it away constantly with oily rags, knowing that frozen moisture could jam the traverse gears or seize the elevation controls. Fuel was rationed carefully. Every liter counted. Idle too long and you wasted it.
Turn off the engine and you risked freezing solid.
So the crew found a middle ground, short bursts of idle running, just enough to keep the metal from contracting and cracking. The tank groaned like an old animal. Every sound had meaning. A sharp pop might be expanding steel. A hiss meant a leak. A grinding noise meant trouble. You learned to listen with the attention of a mechanic and the patience of a saint. One driver later said, "You didn't command the KV, you negotiated with it." Food was another negotiation. Rations were sparse frozen meat, bread hard as a brick, and a lump of sugar the size of a coin. The official ration for tank crews was 4,000 calories a day, but supply breakdowns meant they often got half that. Hunger gnawed quietly, a steady background ache that made tempers short and movements slow. To make it worse, dehydration set in quickly. Men didn't realize it at first. You could feel cold and still be dehydrated. The air was so dry it pulled moisture from your lungs. Melted snow was the only source of water, and melting it took time and precious heat. One crew improvised a solution. They placed snow in their helmets and held them over the engine's exhaust vent. The trick worked, but the water tasted like fuel. They joked it added flavor. The KV's interior was too cramped for privacy, too cold for modesty, and too alive with smells to describe politely. Engine fumes mingled with sweat, diesel, gun oil, and wet wool. Every tanker had his own personal air pocket of odor. And then there were the logistical issues. When you're sealed in a steel box for 12 hours, nature doesn't wait for intermission. Soviet manuals didn't mention a crew sanitation plan, so like soldiers everywhere, they improvised. Empty ration tins became relief containers. Once full, they were sealed and tucked near the floor until the next time the hatch could be safely opened. It was an unspoken rule. You didn't talk about it, you didn't complain, and you definitely didn't knock one over. The joke was that the KV had 6 weapons, the 76-minute gun, 2 machine guns, and 3 full ration tins. Dark humor. But it kept morale from freezing too. The human body wasn't built for such confinement.
Muscles cramped. Fingers went numb.
The driver's hands, wrapped around the levers, ached constantly from vibration. Even breathing became mechanical, slow, shallow, deliberate, to conserve oxygen and body heat. The irony was cruel. Outside, endless space and sky. Inside, claustrophobia and cold. The tank was both shelter and prison. In letters home, soldiers tried to describe it. One gunner wrote, "The tank is warm only when it kills. When the gun fires, the air moves and the heat comes from the shell casing. It lasts a few seconds, then it's gone." Those moments became precious, a strange, fleeting comfort found in violence. On the rare nights when the crew wasn't moving or fighting, they'd park the tank under trees or in shallow trenches, camouflage it with branches, and set up a tiny camp beside it. They'd take turns keeping the fire alive and the engine from freezing. The silence was overwhelming. The only sound was the crackle of burning wood and the occasional pop of distant gunfire. Men spoke softly, if at all. The stars above seemed frozen too bright, sharp, and indifferent. Sometimes they'd share stories about home, food, the warmth of a real stove. One crewman recalled a night when the commander said, "Someday, comrades, we'll laugh about this." No one replied. Not because they disagreed, but because they couldn't imagine laughter surviving the cold. Yet somehow it did. One loader, after days of constipation from cold rations, declared victory when he finally used the ration tin successfully. The crew cheered like they'd captured Berlin. Small triumphs mattered. Another man, upon finding frost inside his gloves, muttered, "At least now my hands match my soul." The commander didn't even flinch, he just nodded. Soviet humor had its own grim poetry. Every machine failure became personal. When the periscope fogged, it wasn't just a technical issue, it was blindness. When the traverse gear froze, it wasn't inconvenience, it was helplessness. The tank was an extension of the crew's body, and when it broke, they felt it like a wound. The KV-1's armor was nearly invincible to German shells early in the war, but that invulnerability came at a price. The thick steel trapped the cold inside just as well as it stopped bullets. The crew might survive a direct hit, only to freeze while waiting for rescue. One veteran remembered seeing a disabled KV months later, half buried in snow. The hatches were closed. Inside, 5 men sat in their places, still wearing gloves and helmets, frozen where they had fallen asleep. The engine had failed first. The rest followed quietly, and yet, most days they carried on. They lit their fires, cranked the engines, shared the last crumbs of bread, and kept the steel beasts alive through sheer willpower. When you think of tank warfare, you picture explosion, speed, destruction. But for Soviet crews in 1942, victory often looked like this: a puff of grey smoke from the exhaust pipe, a weak roar of life from the engine, and the slow grind of tracks over snow. That was success. Survival was mechanical, procedural, one more morning where the machine obeyed. By February, temperatures began to rise slightly. The snow turned slushy, the oil loosened, and the engines roared a little easier. The men, however, were ghosts of themselves, faces hollow, hands raw, eyes permanently squinting against the glare of snow. They had outlasted another Russian winter, though outlasted was just another word for endured. For them, the Germans were faraway abstractions. The real enemy was inside the tank, the cold metal, the hunger, the exhaustion, the endless negotiation between man and machine. Survival wasn't about fighting Germans. It was fighting the cold inside your own tank. You know that first warm day after a long winter, when the snow turns to slush and you can finally smell the earth again? That was how spring arrived on the Eastern Front, not suddenly, but cautiously, as if the season itself didn't trust what it saw. The snow melted slowly, the ground softened reluctantly, and for the men inside the KV-1 tanks it felt like waking from a long, cold coma. It was March 1943 near Rzew, west of Moscow. The front lines were quiet for once, if quiet could mean the distant thump of artillery and the hiss of melting snow dripping from tree branches. The Soviet winter offensive had spent its fury. Now came the pause before the next storm. The tank crews of the 22nd Tank Brigade began what they called the Spring Resurrection. It was part maintenance, part ritual, part survival. Every vehicle was dug out from its icy grave. Snow was shoveled from engine decks, frozen mud chipped from track links, and icicles knocked from gun barrels. The KV-1s looked less like weapons of war and more like prehistoric beasts thawing after centuries in ice. The men worked with quiet focus, breath steaming in the air, their faces half lit by weak sunlight that finally had some warmth in it. For months, they had lived like moles, sealed inside metal burrows, surviving on frozen rations and habit.
Now with the thaw came the first signs of life. The drip of water, the smell of wet earth, the faint squelch of mud underfoot.
It was as though the world had turned the volume back up. Maintenance was everything. In the Red Army, keeping a tank running was as important as firing its gun. The KV-1's 12-cylinder V2K diesel engine required complete cleaning every 100 hours of operation. But in wartime, complete cleaning meant whatever could be done with rags, melted snow, and stubbornness. Each crew had its rhythm. One man scraped carbon deposits from the exhaust manifold with a screwdriver. Another checked oil filters clogged with soot. The driver adjusted track tension using a sledgehammer and a prayer. The gunner cleaned the optics, fogged by months of frozen breath, using bits of cloth torn from an old uniform. The tank commander, meanwhile, wrote everything down: fuel usage, engine temperature, track wear. Soviet bureaucracy didn't stop for weather, but there was a new energy in the air. The men joked again. They moved more freely. Even the tanks seemed to creak with relief. The diary of Alexander Fadin, a 21-year-old KV-1 gunner, captured the moment perfectly. The snow is melting. The tank smells of oil and mud, not death. We cleaned the floor today, used snow and diesel fuel. The commander says it is good for morale. I think it is because he finally got tired of the smell. He wrote about simple things: washing his hands for the first time in weeks, airing out blankets, and shaving with melted snow that was still half ice. These tiny acts became sacred. Fadin later described spring as a kind of rebirth. The sun came back, and so did our faces. For the first time in months, I saw what my comrades looked like. It was hard to tell whether he meant that literally or spiritually. The return of warmth revealed everything the snow had hidden. Abandoned tanks emerged like fossils. Burned-out German panzers tilted in the thawing mud, their hulls blackened, their guns drooping like wilted flowers. Around them lay rusted shell casings, twisted shovels, fragments of uniforms. The thaw also revealed graves, both marked and unmarked. The Red Army burial teams moved quietly, collecting remains, covering what the winter had preserved. The air smelled of damp soil and diesel. It was the scent of the front's uneasy spring. For the tankers, hygiene became symbolic, a way of reclaiming something human. After months of wiping themselves with snow, the first proper wash felt miraculous.
Men stripped to their waists beside half-frozen streams, splashing themselves with water that stung like knives.
They laughed through chattering teeth. One veteran said later, "We were freezing clean. Soap was rare, but not non-existent." Supply trucks had begun reaching the front again, bringing precious items, bars of Grey Army soap, fresh rations, even a few bottles of antiseptic. The smell of soap in a field camp was almost exotic, a reminder that civilization still existed somewhere beyond the horizon, inside the tanks. Crews scrubbed every surface with diesel and rags, wiping away months of grime. It wasn't just for maintenance. It was therapy. The steel, once dead and frozen, gleamed again. The KV-1s looked ready to fight, not for ideology, but for life itself. The thaw also changed how the tanks moved. What had been rock-hard snow turned to bottomless mud. Tracks sank deep, engines strained, and drivers cursed the earth that refused to cooperate. Every kilometer became a negotiation between traction and exhaustion. Yet even the mud felt alive compared to the silence of winter. Birds returned.
Streams gurgled.
Somewhere, far behind the lines, someone was playing an accordion. The notes carried faintly through the thawing air. For men who had lived in metallic tombs for months, these small sounds were almost overwhelming. Letters from home began to arrive again. They came wrinkled, stained, sometimes weeks old, but they came. One tank commander received a package from his wife, a wool scarf, a loaf of rye bread, and a note that simply read, "Spring is coming here too." He kept the note folded in his breast pocket until the end of the war. The Red Army used the spring pause to prepare for new offensives. Mechanics replaced engines, refitted tracks, and upgraded armor where possible. The KV-1, though powerful, was slowly being phased out in favor of the newer T-34-76, but in 1943, the KV still had its purpose holding ground, supporting infantry, and serving as an immovable symbol of Soviet resilience. The crews knew what was coming. The thaw was only a reprieve. Soon, the mud would dry, the roads would harden, and the front would move again. But for now, they savored the simple luxury of warmth and the illusion of normal life. Faden wrote in his diary that April, "We sleep without coats now. The air smells of mud, not frost. The tank leaks oil again, which is somehow comforting. Machines, like people, should sweat. There was wisdom in that. Routine returned." The men ate hot meals, thin soup, sometimes potatoes, sometimes even meat. They mended uniforms, cleaned weapons, and practiced gunnery when the weather allowed. They told stories around campfires that didn't need to be hidden anymore. One night, as the sun set behind the birch trees, the mechanic said quietly, "The cold tried to kill us, but it taught us to live." No one argued. When the offensive resumed that summer, many of those same tanks rolled westward towards Smolensk. Some would never return.
Others would keep fighting all the way to Berlin.
But the men who'd survived that winter carried something indestructible with them, a knowledge of endurance, so deep it became instinct. They had outlasted the cold. They could outlast anything. Decades later, in interviews and memoirs, Soviet veterans rarely talked about battles. They talked about winter, about the way the tanks groaned in the frost, about the sound of snow cracking beneath boots, about that first day when the ice melted and the world smelled alive again. For them, that was victory, not medals or parades, but the return of color, sound, and warmth after months of grey. When the snow melted, so did the silence, and the smell returned first. You know that feeling when you're on a long flight, seatbelt sign on, turbulence shaking your drink, and you suddenly regret that second cup of coffee. Now imagine the flight lasts 10 hours. There's no pressurization, it's 50 degrees below zero, and the bathroom is a metal tube bolted to the side of a bomber. Welcome to life aboard a B-24 Liberator, the least glamorous flying fortress in the sky. It's March 1943 at RAF Lavenham, England. The 8th Air Force's 489th Bomb Group is preparing another daylight raid over Germany. The target, Bremen, a major industrial centre and shipyard. For the crews, it's just another name on the chalkboard. One more in a long line of strategic objectives that all felt the same from 25,000 feet. The B-24 sits on the hard stand like a mechanical whale, long, narrow, and somehow already weary. Its 4 Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp engines will soon roar to life, propellers slicing the morning fog. The plane measures 110 feet across, with a fuselage so cramped you could barely walk upright. Inside, the airmen go through their rituals, checking oxygen lines, loading 50 caliber belts, adjusting heated flight suits. The temperature up there will drop to minus 45 Fahrenheit, and without the suits, exposed skin freezes in under a minute. And yet, amid all this precision and discipline, one question remains universal. Ignored by training manuals, but never by reality. What happens when you have to go? The B-24 had what engineers optimistically called a relief tube. It was a narrow metal pipe about an inch in diameter, fitted with a funnel at one end and vented directly into the slipstream outside. In theory, a simple solution. In practice, a frostbitten nightmare. The funnel was made of aluminum, which meant that at high altitude, it became cold enough to stick to human skin. The smart ones learned quickly, never touch it directly. Gloves on every time. Even then, the experience was far from pleasant. The pressure difference between cabin and sky sometimes created backdrafts. Imagine negative 40-degree air rushing through a narrow pipe at 200 miles per hour. A misaligned seal could make you instantly reconsider your hydration choices. Veterans said you could always tell who'd made that mistake. The walk afterward was unmistakable. The B-24's crew of 10 included the pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, engineer, top turret gunner, tail gunner, nose gunner, and 2 waist gunners. All of them faced the same challenge. 10 men, 1 tube, no privacy. The pilot couldn't leave his seat. The gunners were tethered to their positions. The navigator, usually the most daring, often used empty oxygen bottles or ration cans instead. Some crews carried beer bottles for emergency morale management. The joke went, target over Bremen morale overboard. When the mission ended, the bottles were supposed to be thrown out before landing. Most were, some weren't. Ground crews knew to check before handling anything labeled empty. At 25,000 feet, the world inside a B-24 was a frozen, vibrating, deafening tunnel. The engines droned at 2,700 RPM, filling the fuselage with a constant metallic howl.
Oxygen masks hissed.
The intercom crackled with static. There was no heat except what the human body produced. The thin fuselage leaked cold from every seam. Metal floors were so frigid that touching them with bare hands could peel off skin. Even the heated suits sometimes failed, leaving airmen to shiver uncontrollably. Now, imagine trying to handle a metal funnel or bottle in that environment. It wasn't just discomfort, it was danger. Officially, missions could last up to 9 or 10 hours. Takeoff, climb, formation assembly, crossing the channel, the bomb run, then the long haul home. Crews drank coffee before dawn. Not out of habit, but necessity was the only warm thing available. But coffee had consequences. By hour 4, the navigator would shift uneasily in his seat. By hour 5, one of the waist gunners would mutter over the intercom, "I'm using the bottle." You learn to tune it out. There were no modesty issues at 25,000 feet, just logistics. One radio operator recalled, "You didn't care who was doing what. You just hoped they didn't spill." Sometimes, the simplest tasks became feats of endurance. The relief tube was located near the bomb bay, reachable only by crouching past cables and oxygen lines. The airflow outside created suction so strong it could whistle. The trick was to position yourself without losing balance. as the plane bounced through turbulence. There were stories, half myth, half truth, of turbulence turning the relief stream into a fine mist that promptly froze and coated the inside of the fuselage in a thin layer of frost. The engineers called it evaporative backscatter. The crews called it something less scientific. Let's just say the B-24 was famous for leaks. But not all relief systems worked the same. Some later models, particularly in the Pacific Theater, were equipped with a small relief container, a removable metal can that could be sealed and emptied after flight. Crews preferred these, even if it meant carrying them through turbulence. The alternative, using the funnel, was a gamble few wanted to repeat. Still, improvisation was the rule. Milk bottles, ration tins, even empty shell casings found new purpose.
War, after all, made resourcefulness an art form. The conditions were brutal beyond imagination.
The cockpit windshield frosted over despite the defroster fans. The gunners' oxygen masks froze stiff from their own breath. Temperatures outside the fuselage dropped below 50 degrees Celsius, cold enough to make rubber hoses brittle and break. At that altitude, even your body felt strange.
Oxygen deprivation made you dizzy.
Your thoughts slowed. Sometimes men forgot what they were doing mid-action, a dangerous combination when holding a bomb release switch or a bottle of dubious contents. The physical misery blurred into a kind of routine. You got used to the cold, the noise, the smell of burnt oil and gunpowder. You accepted the comfort was for civilians. The best you could hope for was not freezing something essential. Veterans later laughed about it. They called themselves airborne plumbers. One waist gunner said, "The Air Corps gave us parachutes, oxygen and guns, but not common sense." You'd think someone would have invented a lid. He wasn't wrong. The absurdity of it all became a form of relief itself. Humor thrived where comfort didn't. Crews kept score of who lasted the longest without using the tube. Others painted little symbols on the fuselage like bomber kill marks, but shaped like bottles. It wasn't exactly regulation, but neither was sanity at 25,000 feet. Still, the practical dangers were real. Frostbite cases weren't limited to faces and fingers. Doctors at RAF Lavenham's medical station treated what they delicately called localized freezing injuries more than once. The official advice circulated quietly. Use caution when employing metallic surfaces at altitude, a masterpiece of understatement. When the bomb run came, all thoughts of plumbing vanished. The plane shook violently as the bomb bay doors opened, the slipstream roaring through the fuselage. The bombardier called out over the intercom, "Bombs away!" The sudden lightness lifted the aircraft slightly, a momentary relief of pressure, like the exhale of a long-held breath. But as soon as the doors closed again, the cold returned, the engines roared, and someone inevitably muttered, "I shouldn't have had that coffee." By the time they turned back toward England, the bottles were full, the oxygen tanks half empty, and every man smelled faintly of fuel, sweat, and desperation. When the Liberator touched down on the rain-slick runway, the crew was too exhausted to care about anything but the ground beneath their boots. The ground crew, however, knew to handle the trash carefully. There were surprises among the empty shells and ration tins. For the men who flew those missions, the memory of cold wasn't just about temperature, it was about helplessness. You couldn't fight the elements, or the physiology, or the absurdity. You just dealt with it. And sometimes, in the retelling decades later, they laughed until they cried.
Because when you faced flak fighters
and freezing air at 25,000 feet, a frozen bottle is the least of your worries. Still, they remembered the lesson. Some bottles didn't survive turbulence. You know that thing where you grab a metal railing in winter and your fingers stick to it for a split second? Now picture that, but it's 25,000 feet up, minus 40 degrees, and the metal railing in question happens to be part of your bathroom. Welcome back to the world of the B-24 Liberator, where even bodily functions had to fight the laws of physics. By late 1943, the crews of the 8th Air Force had learned every strange lesson the sky could teach. They'd learned how to fly in formation so tight that wings nearly overlapped, how to keep engines alive in temperatures that froze, lubricant solid, and how to stay sane while 10 men shared one unpressurized, unheated fuselage for 10 hours straight. They'd also learned that the body doesn't care about mission objectives. At altitude, the ambient temperature dropped to around 40 to 50 degrees Celsius. The B-24's aluminum skin, only a few millimeters thick, offered no insulation. The result was a flying freezer. The crew's heated suits electrically wired through their boots and gloves helped a little, but only when they worked. When they didn't, which was often, toes went numb, fingertips stiffened, and every breath from an oxygen mask crystallized instantly into frost around the edges. The masks made conversation difficult and eating or drinking nearly impossible. Relief? That was a logistical nightmare. The so-called relief tube didn't handle those temperatures gracefully. At sea level, urine would flow neatly down the pipe, out through a vent, and into the slipstream. At 25,000 feet, it froze halfway down. Veterans recalled watching in horror as the funnel filled with frost and the tube clogged like a frozen drain pipe. Once blocked, it was useless for the rest of the mission. The official maintenance manuals offered no advice on thawing a solid column of ice attached to the fuselage. One gunner later quipped, "It was the only time in history a man could shoot down his own plumbing." The workaround. Improvisation. Most crews carried empty bottles, ration tins, or anything with a lid that could survive the cold. But even that came with risk. At 40 degrees, glass became brittle. Drop one bottle on the metal floor and you had an instant, very slippery disaster. Plastic didn't exist in any useful form, and rubber stiffened like wood. Some men tried waxed paper cups from the galley. Those froze mid-use, collapsing like sad little monuments to optimism. The golden rule of bomber hygiene became clear. Whatever you used, hold on tight. The cold didn't just freeze equipment, it froze the crew. Oxygen masks clogged with condensation, icing up around the valves. Breathing became laborious, the air tasting of rubber and cold metal. Men scraped frost from inside their visors using gloved fingers. The gunners wore electrically heated gloves wired to their flight suits through cables that occasionally shorted out. A blown fuse meant a choice: keep working and risk frostbite, or remove the gloves and risk sticking to the machine gun. The temperature inside the B-24 often hovered around 25 degrees Celsius, even lower near the gun turrets where the slipstream leaked in. Waist gunners reported that the freezing wind cut through their flight suits as if they weren't even there. One described it simply: it was like being inside a refrigerator full of ghosts. Under those conditions, going to the bathroom wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a battle. First, you had to remove part of your flight suit, disconnect your heated gloves, and maneuver in a space barely large enough to turn around. Then you had to manage oxygen hoses, electrical wires, and the constant vibration of engines the size of small houses. One misstep could yank an oxygen hose loose or pull a connector out of your suit, killing both heat and air supply. More than one crewman passed out mid-mission because of a dislodged oxygen line. The radio operator aboard one B-24 later wrote, "It was like defusing a bomb while sitting on one. You were always aware that one wrong move could ruin your day or your fingers." And then came the ultimate indignity: frozen plumbing. Veterans reported that even when the relief tube did function, the fluid exiting the aircraft sometimes crystallized instantly, forming a trail of glittering ice behind the bomber. It looked almost beautiful if you didn't know what it was. The sight prompted one WAG to nickname it Operation Yellow Trail. Command didn't appreciate the humor. Occasionally, the frozen stream clung to the fuselage, forming icicles that waved in the slipstream like bizarre decorations. Ground crews discovered this the hard way, scraping them off during maintenance with very long tools. One mechanic dryly noted, "At least we knew which way the wind was blowing. Every part of life aboard a bomber was touched by the cold. Coffee froze in cups, ink solidified in pens, and the thin air turned the simplest mistakes into dangerous ones. If a man spilled water, it became a skating hazard in seconds. Food had to be chewed like jerky, and every now and then someone would laugh at the absurdity of it all because what else could you do?" The humor turned dark.
But it kept people human. They joked about high altitude,
Constipation, about the anti-aircraft funnel, about the permafrost plumbing system. They said that whoever designed the B-24 must have been all brains and no bladder. When crews returned from missions, they'd swap stories in the mess hall, some heroic, others just absurd. A pilot might brag about dodging flak over Hamburg. A gunner might counter with how he survived a frozen stream counterattack. But beneath the jokes, the physical strain was real. Dehydration was rampant. To avoid the whole ordeal, many men simply stopped drinking fluids before missions. That worked until they realized dehydration made frostbite worse. Blood thickened in the cold, circulation slowed, and tissue damage came faster. Doctors at RAF Lavenham's medical wing started tracking cases of frostbite and dehydration. Their reports noted that airmen who drank too little water were twice as likely to suffer cold-related injuries. It was a cruel paradox: drink and suffer mid-air misery. Don't drink and risk losing your fingers. No one won. Psychologically, the strain built quietly. The constant cold wore down morale more than fear did. Fear came and went. The cold never left. You learned to think slowly, speak slowly, even feel slowly. Every motion required calculation. Crews started naming their planes after warmth. Hot stuff. Sun Girl, the heater from hell. It was a kind of defiance, a reminder of what they missed. During one mission in December 1943, the navigator of Sun Girl scribbled a single line in his logbook between coordinates. Everything up here is frozen solid, including our spirits. Still they kept flying. By the 7th hour of flight, exhaustion and cold merged into a strange, dreamlike state. Men saw Mirage's sunlight refracting through frost on the plexiglass, making halos that looked almost holy. The endless engine drone became hypnotic. You could almost forget you were at war until the next burst of flak snapped you back. One veteran described it best. It wasn't courage that kept us going. It was inertia. The same force that kept the ice frozen kept us moving. As the bombers turned for home, the sun dipped below the clouds, casting everything in pale gold.
Inside, frost coated every surface like crystal.
The relief tubes had long since frozen shut. Bottles were full.
Fingers were numb.
The men sat in silence, watching the contrails fade behind them like chalk lines on a blackboard. Someone cracked a weak joke about liquid assets. Nobody laughed. They were too tired. When they landed back in England, the ground crew opened the hatches and were greeted by a blast of stale, freezing air that smelled of oil, sweat, and cold metal. Inside, frost clung to the walls in delicate patterns, as if nature had tried to decorate the inside of a refrigerator. One mechanic pointed to the frozen relief tube, glittering faintly in the light, and muttered, "Guess that's one way to plug a leak." He wasn't wrong. For the men of the 8th Air Force, the missions blurred together. Bremen, Hamburg, Kiel, names that all smelled of cordite and cold. But what they remembered most wasn't the danger or even the noise. It was the cold that seeped into everything: skin, metal, memory, and stayed there long after the war ended. By the time it thawed, the mission was already over. You know that strange silence when a plane lands and the engines finally shut down, that moment when all the noise you've been living in suddenly disappears and your ears keep ringing in its memory? That's what it felt like when a B-24 Liberator returned from a mission over Germany. 10 men climbed out of a flying freezer, blinking in the weak English daylight, ears humming, faces pale with exhaustion. The air smelled of grass and oil instead of cordite and fear. For the first time in 10 hours, they could breathe without frost forming inside their masks. It's RF Lavenham, Suffolk, England. Late 1943, the tarmac is slick from drizzle. The air damp and heavy, the kind of cold that seeps quietly into your bones. Not the knife-sharp cold of high altitude, but a tired, earthly chill. The B-24 crews are landing one by one, each bomber staggering in on bent landing gear, oil streaking the wings, sometimes missing an engine or two. The men inside are barely moving. Their heated suits have shorted out hours earlier. Their oxygen masks hang loose around their necks, the rubber stiff with frost.
Every step down the ladder feels heavier than the one before, and yet they made it.
That alone is a small miracle. The first people to meet them aren't officers or reporters, they're the ground crews. Grease-stained, sleep-deprived men who know each aircraft by name, who've spent the morning pacing the flight line and pretending not to count how many didn't come back. They move quickly, checking oil leaks, logging damage, hauling ammunition belts out of the waste positions. And then there's the less glamorous part, cleanup. They'd learned long ago to wear gloves. Frozen relief bottles were collected carefully, their contents thawing unpleasantly in the warmer hangar air. Some were glass, some tin, all fragile reminders of what 10 hours in the stratosphere did to human dignity. One mechanic joked, "We fixed the engines but not the plumbing." Another replied, "That's the Air Corps for you, the sky's full of heroes and frozen hoses." Dark humor passed like currency among men who needed it. After every mission came the debriefing. The crews shuffled into a long, drafty building where coffee was always hot and strong enough to peel paint. They dropped their gear, oxygen masks, flak jackets, flight boots in a pile near the door. The room smelled like sweat, wool, and tobacco. Intelligence officers sat waiting with clipboards, ready to record flak concentrations, fighter sightings, bomb drop accuracy. The questions came fast. What altitude?
Any losses? Did you see shoots?
The answers were short, flat, and sometimes mumbled. The airmen weren't uncooperative, just numb. After 10 hours in a tin can over enemy territory, the human mind needed time to catch up. Behind them, a flight surgeon observed quietly, clipboard in hand. He wasn't looking for tactical details. He was studying faces, pale lips, trembling hands, vacant eyes. He noted who needed rest, who needed stitches, and who needed something stronger, the unspoken medicine that came in a bottle and tasted like permission to forget. Statistically, half of them wouldn't make it through their tour. The 8th Air Force's heavy bomber crews had one of the highest casualty rates of any Allied branch. In 1943 alone, losses averaged 50% before a man completed his required 25 missions. The odds were brutal. Every return was a quiet defiance of mathematics. That knowledge hung in the air during every debrief, unspoken but understood. No one said, "Good job." They said, "See you tomorrow," because tomorrow might not come, and everyone preferred to pretend otherwise. After debrief came medical checks, frostbite, burns, oxygen deprivation. The flight surgeons worked fast, wrapping fingers, checking pupils, prescribing rest that no one really got. They knew that most of the damage wasn't visible. Sleep was the next mission, and not everyone succeeded. The adrenaline crash hit like gravity, sudden, heavy, absolute. Men fell asleep sitting up, helmets still on. Some lay on the floor near the stove, boots steaming. The warmth was almost painful. In the quiet that followed each mission, the ground crews began their next one. They replaced frozen lines, patched bullet holes, and wiped frost from control panels. They cleaned the bomb bay with hoses, sometimes finding fragments of flak embedded in the metal. And yes, they checked the relief tubes. A clogged one meant corrosion, sometimes even pressure damage to the venting systems. It was dirty work, but essential. War, it turned out, ran on maintenance as much as courage. The next morning, everything would look ready again. Polished, refueled, rearmed as if yesterday's ordeal had never happened. For the airmen, though, the war clung to them like frost. They carried the smell of the aircraft on their clothes, engine oil, leather, gunpowder, and something indefinable, the scent of cold metal and fear. In the mess hall, conversation drifted between mundane and surreal. One man complained that the powdered eggs were worse than German flak. Another swore he saw his own frost trail drift past another bomber's wing. The laughter was thin but real, a sound that reminded everyone they were still here. Letters home tried to capture what words couldn't. "We're fine," they wrote, just tired. "Weather's cold. Morale's good." But tucked between the lines was an exhaustion that no statistic could measure. Some veterans later said the war's cruelest trick wasn't danger, it was routine. Everything became procedure. You'd suit up, fly, freeze, return, report, sleep.
Then do it again.
The missions blurred until the body stopped caring and the mind stopped noticing. That was the real endurance, not surviving the flak, but surviving the repetition. One B-24 crewman, years later, summed it up in a single sentence. It wasn't the Germans we fought most days. It was the cold, the boredom, and the smell. Another added, the war taught us patience mostly with our own bladders. That line became a favorite among reunion groups decades later. The laughter that followed wasn't just about the joke. It was about remembering they could laugh at all. As 1944 rolled on, technology improved, better heaters, redesigned tubes, even insulated gloves. But no matter how advanced the aircraft became, the human problem stayed the same. You could mechanize war, but not the people inside it. And maybe that was the point. All those small indignities, frozen fingers, leaky funnels, bottles rattling underfoot became symbols of something bigger. They were proof that underneath all the machinery, men were still men, fragile, flawed, absurdly human. They joked about it because joking was safer than despair. They endured it because they had no choice. They told the stories later, not for glory, but for understanding, because in those unremarkable, uncomfortable moments when frost coated their eyelashes and the relief tube froze shut, they found the kind of endurance that history books rarely mention. When the war ended, many B-24s were scrapped within months. The metal went to peacetime factories, the engines sold off or melted down, the machines disappeared. But the men didn't forget. In veterans' reunions decades later, the stories always came back. The noise, the cold, the smell, the endless bottles. They told them quietly, often with a grin that faded halfway through, replaced by silence. Not all memories are heavy. Some are just cold. Those who returned from RAF Lavenham went home changed. They brought back medals, yes, but also frostbitten scars, a permanent squint against imagined glare, and a deep appreciation for central heating. One airman told his grandson years later, every time you flush a toilet, thank an engineer. It was half a joke, half a prayer. In the end, they measured their missions not in miles or tonnage, but in small victories, a working heater, an unfrozen tube, a safe landing. The world remembers the bombs dropped by the ton, but what the men remembered were the bottles, the frost, the laughter in the cold. That was the real weight of war, measured not in destruction, but endurance. They dropped bombs by the ton, but left behind stories measured in ounces.